On the afternoon of March 14, 1932, the sky above Rochester, New York, had settled into a heavy, unrelenting shade of gray. It was the kind of late winter day that seems to exist outside the normal flow of time, a day where the cold seeps deep into the brickwork of every building and the pale winter sun refuses to push its way through the thick ceiling of clouds overhead. Along East Avenue, the traffic moved at a measured, unhurried pace, passing through the tall iron gates of the most magnificent estate in the entire city. To the factory workers heading home from their shifts, to the bankers wrapped in their long wool coats, and to the families strolling past on their afternoon walks, the towering Georgian Revival mansion standing majestically behind those iron gates represented something far greater than architecture. It was the living, breathing symbol of what a determined human being could achieve in America. It was the stronghold of the Kodak king. It was the residence of George Eastman, a man who had, by nearly every reasonable measure, reshaped the modern world more profoundly than any statesman, military commander, or philosopher of his era. He was the individual who had made memory accessible to everyone, who had placed the extraordinary power to pause time and preserve a moment directly into the hands of ordinary people, from factory workers to farmers, from schoolchildren to grandmothers. But inside the second-floor bedroom of that grand 50-room estate, the atmosphere carried no trace of triumph or celebration. Instead, it held the quiet, unmistakable weight of a final chapter being written. George Eastman was 77 years old. On that particular Monday morning, he was dressed in his pajamas, seated in a chair that seemed almost too large for the frame it now held. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and factory floors now appeared smaller, quieter, and more deliberate than the world had ever seen him. The room around him was immaculately arranged, every surface clean and ordered, carrying the faint scent of the antiseptic cleansers used by his dedicated household staff and the familiar, comforting smell of old leather-bound books that lined the shelves from floor to ceiling. Just moments before, the room had been filled with the low, respectful murmurs of several men in well-tailored suits. His personal attorney, his trusted physician, and a small group of carefully chosen witnesses had gathered around him in that very room. They had watched in quiet attention as the great industrialist, with a hand that remained remarkably steady and deliberate, signed a formal codicil amending his will. He had been gracious throughout the entire process. He had been entirely clear-minded and composed. He had even offered a brief, dry remark in his characteristically understated manner, the kind of quiet humor that those who knew him well had always appreciated and admired. He watched each of them leave the room, his calm eyes following their movement until the heavy oak door swung shut with a soft, definitive click, sealing out the noise and motion of the world beyond. And then he was alone. The silence that filled the room in that moment was unlike any ordinary quiet. It was total and complete. Downstairs, in the sweeping grandeur of the estate's conservatory, there stood an enormous Aeolian pipe organ, an instrument of such tremendous power and resonance that its deepest notes could send vibrations trembling through the crystal chandeliers above. But on this day that organ stood perfectly still and perfectly silent. The household staff moved through the kitchen with careful, gentle footsteps, preparing for an evening dinner that the master of the house would never sit down to enjoy. George Eastman remained in the stillness of his room and lowered his gaze to his hands, resting quietly in his lap. These were the very hands that, 50 years earlier, had mixed photographic chemicals in a modest kitchen sink by lamplight. These were the hands that had constructed a global industrial empire from nothing but an idea and an unshakable will. These were the hands that had written checks totaling more than $100 million in donations to universities, medical schools, hospitals, and dental clinics spread across 2 continents. But now, those same hands struggled to manage even the small, private task of buttoning a shirt without considerable pain and effort. For the better part of 2 years, George Eastman had been quietly waging a deeply personal battle against his own body. He had been diagnosed with a degenerative spinal condition, a progressive hardening of the tissue within the lower spinal cord that advanced slowly and without mercy. It was a condition that did not take a person swiftly. Instead, it worked patiently and steadily, dismantling a person piece by piece. It stripped away balance first, then physical strength, and eventually the kind of personal dignity that a man of Eastman's character held more precious than any financial asset. He had begun to shuffle when he moved through the hallways of his estate, dragging his feet slowly across the rich European rugs he had imported with such care. He required assistance simply to rise from a seated position. For a man whose entire life had been constructed on the foundational pillars of independence, self-sufficiency, and absolute personal control, this creeping physical limitation represented something far more devastating than mere discomfort. He had witnessed this kind of deterioration before with heartbreaking clarity. He had watched his mother, Maria, the single most important and beloved person in his entire life, fade slowly into a state of complete helplessness near the end of her years. He had spent long, painful hours sitting at her bedside in this very house, watching the brightness gradually leave her eyes, watching the woman who had sacrificed everything for him become a prisoner within her own failing body. In those quiet, agonizing hours beside her, he had made a silent and absolute promise to himself and to whatever forces governed the universe that he would not allow that same fate to claim him. He would not surrender his dignity. He would not become an object of sorrowful pity. He rose from his chair in a slow, measured process that demanded every ounce of his concentration and physical resolve. He crossed the room to his desk, a beautifully crafted piece of furniture kept in the precise, organized state of a disciplined engineer. He reached for his fountain pen. He pulled a yellow legal pad toward him. He had no need to compose a lengthy memoir or articulate the full complexity of everything he had experienced and felt across 7 decades of extraordinary living. He was, above all else, a man of deliberate and purposeful action, a man who had always believed in the power of simplicity and the beauty of removing whatever was unnecessary. The very marketing slogan of his beloved company had always been, "You press the button, we do the rest." That philosophy of elegant efficiency had guided every decision of his professional life, and it would guide this one as well. He wrote in a firm, clear hand, the nib of his pen moving with steady intention across the page. He addressed it to his friends. He paused for a moment, his gaze perhaps drifting toward the window and the dormant winter garden outside, where the bare branches of the trees stood dark and patient against the pale sky. Then he continued, "My work is done." It was not an emotional declaration. It was a statement of plain and verifiable fact. The company he had built was secure and thriving. The philanthropic foundations he had established were fully organized and funded. The legal trusts were in proper order. Every commitment had been honored. There were no unresolved matters, no outstanding obligations, and no loose threads of any kind. And then he wrote the final 2 words, a brief closing thought that was at once a quiet challenge and a deeply human confession. Why wait? He signed his initials with a deliberate and practiced flourish. He set the pen down on the surface of the desk, aligning it carefully and precisely with the edge of the legal pad, exactly as he had always placed every tool after finishing with it. The logic, from his particular perspective, was clear and complete. When a machine has broken beyond the possibility of repair, one does not allow it to sit and slowly deteriorate. One makes a conscious and respectful decision to bring its operation to a close. It was the reasoning of an engineer, measured and unsentimental. But it was also the quiet expression of a man who had grown profoundly and deeply isolated within the magnificent walls of his own success. The mansion around him was far too large for one person. The recognition and admiration of a grateful world felt impossibly distant from the stillness of this room. He was surrounded by masterworks of art by Rembrandt and Tintoretto, but great paintings cannot hold a conversation. He was the wealthiest man in Rochester, and yet the space he occupied felt less like a home and more like a beautifully furnished room that had somehow lost its warmth and purpose. He reached into the drawer of his nightstand and retrieved a steel pistol, a souvenir he had brought back with him as a keepsake from one of his beloved trips to Africa. It was a cold and weighty object with a single function. With characteristic thoughtfulness, he had also placed a folded damp cloth nearby. Even in this most final and personal of decisions, George Eastman remained true to his nature. He was considerate. He was precise. He had no desire to create unnecessary difficulty for the members of his household staff who would need to attend to the room afterward. He wanted his departure from this world to be as orderly and as considerate as every other undertaking he had ever pursued. He made his way to the bed and settled himself carefully upon it, adjusting the pillows to ease the persistent pressure on his spine. He arranged the damp cloth over his chest, not for his own comfort, but as a practical measure born of thoughtfulness for others. He was entirely composed. He was entirely still. He took a slow and deliberate breath, drawing in the familiar scent of the room one final time, perhaps allowing his mind to wander briefly back to his mother, to the early and exciting days of the darkroom, to the electric feeling of holding his very first patent in his hands. And then, with that same remarkable steadiness of hand that had signed the documents of his empire and extended itself in greeting to heads of state and leaders of industry, he made his final choice. The sound that followed was muffled and quiet, absorbed by the heavy draperies and the thick fabrics of the room. It was not a thunderclap. It was a period placed at the end of a very long and very full sentence. Downstairs, several members of the household staff heard what sounded like a heavy book dropping flat onto a floor somewhere above them. Mr. Eastman, they each privately reasoned, was a deeply private man, and it was not unusual for books or documents to fall from his desk or shelves. But as the silence that followed stretched itself out longer and heavier than any ordinary quiet, a gradual and undeniable sense of unease began to move through the corridors of the house. Something in the atmosphere of the great estate had shifted in a way that could be felt but not easily explained. When they finally gathered the courage and the concern necessary to enter the room, the air had already settled. The man who had fundamentally and permanently transformed the way the human race perceived, recorded, and remembered itself was gone. The profound irony of this particular moment carries with it an almost literary power. At the very instant that George Eastman made his final departure from the world, millions of human beings across the globe were actively using the extraordinary invention he had given them. In the gardens of Paris, a father was crouching down with a small camera to capture his young daughter laughing among the flowers. On the streets of London, a visitor was lifting that same kind of camera toward the great face of Big Ben. In a celebration hall in Tokyo, an entire family was gathered together in their finest clothing, preserving the radiant memory of a wedding day in a photograph that would be passed down through generations. George Eastman had created a device that, in the most meaningful sense, defeated the passage of time. He had granted the world the remarkable ability to capture a single living moment and preserve it with perfect clarity, to freeze the expression on a beloved face long after that face was gone from the world. He was the architect and the guardian of modern human memory. He had filled the photo albums of countless families across every nation with weddings and birthdays and first steps and golden sunsets. But in the quiet of his own bedroom, surrounded by the immense and almost unimaginable wealth that those preserved memories had generated, he found himself unable to locate a single compelling reason to add even one more day to the collection. He was the great visionary of the 19th century, a man who had seen the future clearly and unmistakably before anyone else around him. Before George Eastman arrived on the scene and redirected the course of history, photography had been a complex and exclusive practice, a dark art belonging almost exclusively to trained chemists who worked with heavy and cumbersome glass plates and breathed the dangerous fumes of harsh chemicals. It was expensive, demanding, and available only to a privileged few. Eastman had looked at all of that complexity and made the single most important decision of his professional life. He said, simply and with absolute conviction, I can solve this. He put a camera in the hands of children. He brought the power of the photograph within reach of ordinary people everywhere. He made it entirely possible for a modest farmer in rural Ohio to own a portrait of his elderly mother that was every bit as beautiful and dignified as a portrait of royalty. He altered the human experience in ways that were deep, lasting, and impossible to fully measure. Because of what he built and what he gave away, the world now remembers its own past in vivid and extraordinary detail. Because of his vision and his determination, history has a face. But the man responsible for this transformative gift to humanity spent his personal life in a state of quiet and profound aloneness. The note he left behind on that yellow legal pad carries a weight that is difficult to reckon with even today. Why wait? It reveals with chilling simplicity the inner workings of a mind that had always approached life as a series of projects requiring efficient management. When a project reaches its conclusion and the costs of maintaining it begin to outweigh its capacity for meaningful output, a clear-headed decision must be made. It was the ultimate and final assertion of personal control over circumstances. But it was also, beneath its cool and rational surface, the quiet expression of a man who had constructed around himself a fortress of solitude so thick and so complete that the warmth of genuine human connection had long since been unable to find its way through. The mansion at 900 East Avenue was not truly a home in any deeply felt sense of the word. It was a museum of one man's extraordinary achievements, and he was its sole and permanent resident. He moved through its long and elegant hallways alone, listening to the majestic sound of the pipe organ being played by a hired musician whose sole responsibility was to fill the enormous house with sound and keep the silence from becoming too absolute. He ate his breakfast alone each morning with a newspaper folded beside his plate, staring calmly up at the oil portraits hanging on the walls above the wainscoting. This is not simply the story of a wealthy man who reached the end of a long life. This is something considerably more important and considerably more enduring than that. This is the story of the true cost of extraordinary genius. It is the story of what can happen to a man who gives everything he has to the world with open and generous hands, who empties himself completely in the service of progress and legacy, and who ultimately finds himself standing in a room full of beautiful and expensive things with nothing left inside to give and no one nearby to receive it. We look at the black and white photographs of the roaring 1920s, those smiling and carefree faces frozen in moments of pure and uncomplicated happiness, and we rarely pause long enough to think about the man who made those photographs possible. We enjoy the captured light without ever fully considering the complicated life of the man who learned how to capture it. George Eastman dedicated his entire existence to bringing clarity and focus to the world around him. He spent decades sharpening the image, refining the process, improving the technology, and expanding access. But in the end, his own world had blurred into a gray and difficult haze from which he could find no clear path forward, and so he made the decision to step quietly out of the frame. When the police arrived and the news began to spread through Rochester and then outward across the country and eventually around the world, the shock was immediate and universal. The New York Times placed the story on its front page the following morning. The flags at Kodak Park were lowered respectfully to half-mast. The entire city of Rochester entered a period of genuine and collective mourning. But among those who had known him personally, those who had seen the steel resolve behind his quiet eyes and the rigid and unyielding set of his jaw, there was something else alongside the grief. There was a sense, however uncomfortable to acknowledge, that they had always known he would make this particular choice when the circumstances demanded it. He had lived according to his own principles without exception or apology, and he would depart in precisely the same manner. The question he had left on that yellow legal pad, however, did not disappear with the mourning or the editorials or the memorial services. It lingered in the air above the factory floors and in the echoing halls of the mansion and in the minds of the people who had known him and admired him. Why wait? It was a challenge directed at everyone who remained alive. It was the final declaration of a man who had spent 77 years attempting to organize the beautiful chaos of existence into a clean and perfectly composed square frame. And so the empire of the camera had lost the man who had imagined it into being. The 50-room mansion with its silent pipe organ and its long corridors stood as the permanent monument to the man who had filled it. The great invention of 1888 had outlived its inventor. But the cameras kept clicking. The shutters kept opening and closing. The world kept collecting its memories and pressing them between the pages of albums and passing them down through generations, even as the man who had made all of that possible chose, on a cold and gray March afternoon, to compose his own final image and let the shutter fall. To truly understand how George Eastman arrived at this deeply considered and irreversible decision, it is necessary to rewind the film entirely. It is necessary to travel back beyond the pain of his final years, beyond the grandeur of the mansion, and beyond the staggering accumulation of wealth and recognition. It is necessary to return to the very beginning, to the moment when the entire idea of Kodak existed as nothing more than a restless and ambitious flicker in the mind of a young man who desperately wanted to buy a camera but could not afford the glass plates required to use one. We have to witness the rise before we can fully understand the weight of what followed. We have to watch the empire being assembled piece by careful piece, patent by patient patent, in order to appreciate why the man who built it ultimately felt, with perfect clarity and complete conviction, that he had nothing left to wait for. To truly grasp the staggering scale of what George Eastman eventually walked away from on that gray March afternoon in 1932, it is essential to travel back in time to an era when the world moved at a very different pace and when the simple act of capturing a photograph required the dedication, the chemical knowledge, and the physical endurance of a scientist on a field expedition. You have to return to the 1870s, a period when photography was not a casual pastime enjoyed by families on holiday, but rather a demanding, technically complex, and financially prohibitive pursuit available almost exclusively to trained professionals and passionate enthusiasts willing to devote enormous resources to the craft. In those days, producing a single photograph was an undertaking that bore almost no resemblance to the effortless experience that George Eastman would later make possible for billions of people. A photographer of that era was required to possess a detailed working knowledge of chemistry. He had to transport a heavy wooden tripod, a large and unwieldy camera, a portable darkroom tent, and an entire crate filled with fragile glass plates. He had to carefully coat each glass plate with a volatile mixture of chemicals known as collodion, then sensitize the coated plate in a bath of silver nitrate solution, then rush to position and expose the plate before the chemicals began to dry, and then immediately retreat into the darkness of his portable tent to complete the development process before anything could go wrong. It was a physically demanding, chemically hazardous, and deeply time-consuming procedure that stained the photographer's hands and filled his lungs with the acrid fumes of ether. It was a process that effectively excluded the vast majority of humanity from participation. And then George Eastman appeared and everything changed. He did not arrive from a background of privilege or comfortable advantage. On the contrary, his story begins in the shadow of early hardship and genuine financial uncertainty. Born in 1854 in the small town of Waterville, New York, he was brought to Rochester as a young child by his family. But misfortune arrived early and without warning. His father passed away when George was only 7 years old, leaving the family without financial support and facing genuine poverty. The childhood of George Eastman was not one of leisure or ease. It was one of early and serious responsibility. He watched his mother, Maria, open their home to paying boarders in order to generate enough income to keep the family housed and fed, working with tireless determination to provide the best life she possibly could for her children despite the circumstances they faced. That experience of watching his mother carry such a heavy burden with such quiet strength left a permanent and formative impression on the young George. It forged something hard and resilient and deeply determined within him. He left school at the age of 14 to take a position as an office assistant with an insurance company, earning $3 each week. From his earliest working years, he was serious beyond his age, intensely driven, and consumed by the ambition to build a life so financially stable and so secure that the kind of hardship his family had endured would never be able to reach him again. He viewed financial vulnerability the way one might view a dangerous animal lurking near the door, and he devoted the whole of his considerable energy to building the strongest possible walls to keep it permanently at bay. The spark that would eventually ignite the transformation of the entire modern world arrived in George Eastman's life almost by chance. At the age of 24, he began making plans for a journey to Santo Domingo. He wanted to document his travels photographically, and so he purchased all of the equipment that the practice required at the time. What arrived was an overwhelming mountain of gear, a collection of heavy and cumbersome objects so substantial that transporting it required a pack animal. Eastman looked at that pile of equipment, at the heavy glass plates and the massive tripod and the portable darkroom tent, and every instinct of his engineer's mind rejected it outright. He did not make the journey to Santo Domingo. Instead, he turned inward and became completely absorbed by a single driving question that would redirect the entire course of his life. How do I make this simpler? How do I make this lighter? How do I make this accessible to everyone? He began conducting experiments in his mother's kitchen every evening after completing a full day of work at the bank. He mixed chemical emulsions in the sink and conducted heating experiments on the kitchen stove. He read every available article and technical paper he could locate in British photography journals and imported publications. For the better part of 3 years, he worked with an intensity that left almost no room for sleep or ordinary leisure. He was searching for a way to eliminate the cumbersome glass plate entirely, to replace it with something light enough and flexible enough to be rolled into a compact and portable form. He developed a mechanical coating machine to apply photographic emulsion to dry plates. He experimented extensively with paper as a base material. And ultimately he arrived at the discovery that would change the world, a transparent and flexible photographic film that could be rolled, handled, and loaded into a small and simple camera without any of the elaborate preparation that had previously been required. In 1888, George Eastman introduced his masterpiece to the world, and nothing about photography or about the human relationship with memory would ever be quite the same again. He called it the Kodak. The word itself carried no prior meaning. He invented it entirely because he had always admired the letter K, which he felt projected a quality of strength and decisiveness that matched his vision for the product. The camera itself was a revelation of elegant simplicity. It was a compact, lightweight box that arrived in the hands of its owner already loaded with a roll of film capable of producing 100 individual photographs. There were no glass plates to prepare, no chemicals to mix, no complex focusing adjustments to make, and no darkroom tent to erect in the field. The photographer simply pointed the small box toward whatever subject caught their eye, drew back a simple cord to prepare the shutter mechanism, and pressed a button. When the entire roll of film had been used, the photographer did not need to process anything personally. Instead, the entire camera was packaged and mailed back to the factory in Rochester. The skilled technicians there developed the film, produced the finished prints, reloaded the camera with a fresh roll of film, and returned the entire package to the customer by post. The purchase price was $25. The marketing slogan that Eastman composed to introduce this revolutionary device to the public was a single sentence of extraordinary commercial genius, a phrase so perfectly constructed that it has echoed through the decades of marketing history that followed. You press the button, we do the rest. It is nearly impossible to adequately communicate the magnitude of the impact that this invention carried. It was the defining technological moment of the 19th century in much the same way that the introduction of the personal computer or the smartphone defined the technological landscape of their respective eras. In a single stroke, photography ceased to be the exclusive domain of trained professionals and became the cherished pastime of everyone. It belonged to the young mother capturing her infant's first unsteady steps across the kitchen floor. It belonged to the young soldier departing for a distant conflict and wanting to carry a piece of home in his breast pocket. It belonged to the couple celebrating a summer picnic, to the elderly grandparents wanting a portrait of their grandchildren, to every ordinary human being who had ever wanted to hold on to a moment that was passing. George Eastman had opened the door to the visual history of the entire human race and invited everyone inside without exception. The Kodak camera spread across the world with extraordinary speed and momentum. By 1896, the 100,000th Kodak camera had rolled off the production line in Rochester. The factory complex expanded continuously, pushing outward across city blocks, filling the sky above the industrial district with the productive smoke of round-the-clock manufacturing. Kodak Park grew from a factory into something resembling a self-contained community, a sprawling and impressive industrial campus with its own dedicated fire department, its own power generation facility, and even its own private railroad connection. And the financial reward that accompanied all of this success arrived not in a trickle but in a sustained and powerful flood. George Eastman became one of the wealthiest individuals in the entire United States, a recognized titan of industry who stood confidently alongside the greatest names in American commercial history, figures like Rockefeller, Ford, and Carnegie. But unlike many of the dominant industrialists of his era, who were frequently viewed with deep public suspicion and resentment, Eastman occupied a different position in the popular imagination. He was a quiet and unpretentious man who allowed the quality of his products to speak on his behalf. He paid his workforce generously and introduced profit-sharing programs that gave his employees a meaningful stake in the success of the enterprise, an idea that was genuinely radical and forward-thinking in the business culture of that period. He believed, with apparent sincerity, that the people whose labor had built the company deserved to share meaningfully in whatever prosperity that labor produced. But with the arrival of such immense wealth came a new and unfamiliar challenge, the question of what to do with it. George Eastman was not temperamentally suited to the extravagant lifestyle that many of his peers in American industry embraced with visible enthusiasm. He had no interest in luxury yachts or stables of racehorses. He did not shower lavish gifts upon a wife and family because he had neither. His life was organized around his work and around his devotion to his mother. But his extraordinary success demanded a home that reflected the scale of what he had accomplished, a physical headquarters for the empire of his life. And so in 1905, construction began on the estate at 900 East Avenue. What he built was not merely a house. It was a palace of the highest order. The mansion was conceived in the Georgian Revival architectural style, a massive and imposing structure of reinforced concrete and fired brick extending across 35,000 square feet of carefully landscaped grounds. It contained 50 rooms, 12 bathrooms, a private elevator, a centralized vacuum system, a dedicated telephone switchboard, and every other technological convenience that the most advanced engineering of the early 20th century could provide. It was a house of the future dressed in the aesthetic vocabulary of the past. The interior was a comprehensive demonstration of Eastman's lifelong obsession with the finest available materials and the highest achievable standards. He selected the richest teak timbers from India for the woodwork, the most beautiful marble available from Italian quarries for the floors and surfaces, and the most luxurious velvet from French mills for the upholstery and draperies. The library was lined floor to ceiling with thousands of carefully chosen volumes. The formal dining room, with its crystal chandeliers catching the light above a table long enough to accommodate dozens of guests, projected an atmosphere of gracious and effortless grandeur. But the room that spoke most eloquently of the full and complicated nature of George Eastman's inner life was not the library or the dining room. It was the music room at the center of the house. George Eastman possessed a deep and genuine love for music, a love that was entirely sincere and entirely unrequited by his own natural abilities. He could not play a single instrument. He could not read a line of musical notation. He had great difficulty carrying even the simplest melody in his own voice. And yet, despite all of this, he had one of the largest and most magnificent private Aeolian pipe organs in the entire country installed in the center of his home. He engaged the services of a professional organist to come to the house every single morning, without exception, to perform while Eastman ate his breakfast alone in the great dining room below. The deep, resonant tones of the organ would move through the vast and silent hallways of the mansion each morning like a tide of majestic sound, filling every room with a beauty and a grandeur that somehow made the emptiness feel larger rather than smaller. By the decade of the 1920s, George Eastman had achieved a position in the cultural and civic life of Rochester that was virtually without parallel. He had financed and built the Eastman Theater, an extraordinary venue dedicated to bringing the finest musical performances within reach of everyone in the city, not merely those who could afford expensive tickets. He had donated transformative sums of money to the University of Rochester, funding the creation of a medical school that would become one of the most respected institutions of its kind in the nation. He had sent checks to dental clinics in London, Paris, Rome, Brussels, and Stockholm, driven by the deeply personal conviction that dental suffering was one of the most unnecessary and most easily addressed sources of human misery in the world. He was a philanthropist of genuinely global reach, a man whose generosity had carved his name into the stone of important buildings on 2 separate continents. But as the Kodak empire climbed to heights that seemed almost mythical from the outside, as the stock price of the company rose to levels that made financial analysts use the language of wonder and disbelief, the man at the very center of all of it remained something of a compelling and poignant mystery. He was a man who possessed everything that the world associated with the concept of complete and total success. And yet, each evening, he returned to a 50-room house and ate dinner with no one but the sound of the organ for company. The mansion at 900 East Avenue was the crown jewel of his achievement. It was the concrete and architectural expression of the entire journey from the poverty and uncertainty of a fatherless boy in a small upstate New York town to the unquestioned status of the wealthiest bachelor in the most prosperous nation on earth. It was the empire made visible in every sense. But empires, it turns out, are deeply lonely places for the individuals who build them and rule them alone. The rise of George Eastman is one of the most compelling and instructive chapters in the long history of American ambition and achievement. It is the story of extraordinary intelligence applied with extraordinary persistence, of a product so genuinely transformative that it reshaped the everyday experience of being human. But as we move forward into the next phase of his story, it becomes necessary to look past the bank statements and the factory rooftops and the framed patents on the wall. It becomes necessary to walk through the front door of that magnificent house and experience it honestly and clearly for what it actually was to the man who lived inside it. It was not simply the reward for decades of productive labor. It was a fortress. It was a cage constructed of gold and exceptional craftsmanship by a man who harbored a deep and enduring fear of disorder and vulnerability. He had spent his professional life organizing the entire visual world into the clean and reassuring geometry of a photograph. But he had never quite discovered how to compose a frame for his own contentment and sense of belonging. The great tree that had grown from the small seed of 1888 cast an enormous and impressive shadow. And it was there, deep within that shadow, inside the fireproof walls of the mansion, that a quieter and more difficult story had been slowly accumulating for years. The camera had been built to capture light. But the house had been built to contain silence. And the silence year after year was growing louder. The mansion at 900 East Avenue was an architectural achievement that had been designed and constructed to endure the passage of centuries. It had been built of reinforced concrete and fired brick with deliberate and careful attention to its capacity to resist the chaotic forces of the natural world. The walls could withstand fire. They could deflect the wind of the harshest Rochester winter. But there was one force that all of that careful engineering proved completely powerless to address. The silence moved through the walls as freely as light through glass, and it settled into every room and every corridor without any resistance at all. To someone passing through the iron gates at the front of the property and pausing to admire the structure from the outside, the mansion presented itself as the obvious and well-deserved reward of a spectacularly successful life. It had 50 rooms and 12 bathrooms and 9 fireplaces and a conservatory that maintained an extraordinary display of blooming plants and exotic flowers even through the most brutal weeks of the Rochester winter. It was the American dream rendered permanent and monumental in brick and carefully chosen marble. But to George Eastman himself, to the man who moved through its hallways alone in the late hours of the evening when the last servant had retired and the organist had packed away his sheet music, the mansion was something quite different from all of that. It was a golden cage of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary silence. To understand the particular weight of George Eastman's later years, it is important to view the house not through the eyes of an admiring visitor but through the eyes of a man who had built it as a gift for someone he loved and who had then been left to live in it alone. A genuine home is a place of noise and comfortable disorder, a place where laughter rises unexpectedly and conversations overlap and the corners accumulate the small evidence of shared daily life. The Eastman estate had none of those qualities. It was a place of perfect and somewhat intimidating order. Every object occupied its assigned position with the precision of a museum installation. Every hour of every day followed its established sequence without deviation or surprise. The household staff who maintained the property performed their duties with exceptional skill and exceptional quietness, moving through the rooms with the practiced invisibility of people who had learned that the master of the house valued his routines and his privacy above almost everything else. The deeper tragedy of the mansion becomes apparent when one understands the original purpose for which it was built. George Eastman designed and constructed it for two people. It was built as a palace of comfort and security for his mother, Maria. The emotional bond between George and Maria Eastman was not simply a warm filial affection. It was the single most important and most defining relationship of his entire life. She was the woman who had opened her home to strangers in order to feed her children. She was the woman who had believed in her son completely and unreservedly when he was conducting chemical experiments in her kitchen sink at midnight. Every dollar he earned, every factory he expanded, every patent he filed, every check he wrote was in some deep and unspoken way an expression of his devotion to her and his determination to repay the sacrifices she had made. He built the mansion at 900 East Avenue so that she could spend her final years surrounded by the comfort and luxury that she had never been able to access during the difficult decades of her working life. But the one thing that his wealth could not purchase was time. Maria Eastman did move into the great house, and she did enjoy its comforts for a brief and precious period. But she was already elderly when she arrived, and her health deteriorated with a pace that no amount of money and no quality of medical care could slow. In 1907, just 2 years after the completion of the house that had been built for her, Maria Eastman passed away. The impact of her death on her son was not the composed and measured response of a disciplined industrialist managing a difficult circumstance. It was the shattering grief of a man who had just lost the single person who had given his entire life its deepest and most essential meaning. He was 53 years old, at the absolute peak of his professional powers, the acknowledged master of a global enterprise. And he wept without restraint. After the death of his mother, the character of the mansion changed in a way that was subtle but permanent. It stopped being a home and became something closer to a memorial. George Eastman kept his mother's bedroom exactly as she had left it, with her clothing hanging in the wardrobe and her sewing materials arranged on the table just as she had placed them. For the next 25 years, he lived in the house alongside the memory of her presence. The magnificent dining room, built to accommodate large and lively gatherings, often saw nothing more than a solitary figure eating a carefully measured breakfast in the company of a folded newspaper while the organ played somewhere in the distance. The emptiness of 50 rooms amplified rather than absorbed the isolation he carried. He was the man who had given the entire world its most powerful tool for preserving family memories, for capturing the weddings and the first birthdays and the graduation celebrations that people treasure most deeply. And yet he had no family of his own to photograph, no shared history to preserve, no one with whom to sit and turn the pages of an album and remember together. He was the greatest architect of human nostalgia who had ever lived, and he was entirely alone with his own. To manage the void, George Eastman constructed his social life with the same methodical precision he applied to every other aspect of his existence. He hosted elegant Sunday evening gatherings in the music room of the mansion, inviting the respected figures of Rochester society for dinner followed by carefully curated concerts. These events were not casual or spontaneous occasions. They were organized productions with set arrival times, assigned seating and carefully chosen musical programs featuring the works of Wagner, Beethoven, and Bach. Eastman would occupy his designated position at the center of the assembled company, listening to the music with visible attention and appreciation, surrounded by people who admired and respected him, and yet somehow maintaining an almost imperceptible distance from the genuine warmth of human connection that he was simultaneously seeking and unable to fully access. He invited young executives and their families to breakfast gatherings at the house, drawn to the energy and optimism that younger people carried and wanting to absorb some of it into the atmosphere of the place. He was known among his guests as a generous if somewhat formally mannered host. He enjoyed cooking for people himself, taking quiet pleasure in preparing lemon meringue pies and other carefully made dishes, using the act of feeding others as a means of expressing a warmth and a care that he found difficult to communicate through ordinary conversation. But the moment the last guest's automobile crunched down the gravel driveway and disappeared through the iron gates, the silence would return immediately and completely. The servants would quietly clear the remaining dishes, the organist would tuck his sheet music under his arm and depart, and George Eastman would be left alone again with his Rembrandt paintings and his considerable fortune and the particular quality of quiet that a very large house generates when only one person remains inside it. There is something deeply revealing in the way the house itself was organized and used. It had been designed for the purposes of impressive entertainment and highly efficient functioning. It operated more like a well-managed facility than like a lived-in family dwelling. Eastman maintained a personal workshop within the estate where he spent contented hours tinkering with small mechanical problems, adjusting door latches that had developed a slight resistance or repairing clocks that had lost their precise timing. He was genuinely happier with a screwdriver in his hand and a practical problem to solve than he was navigating the unpredictable and often uncomfortable terrain of deep human intimacy. He understood mechanisms with complete clarity and complete confidence. He understood that when component A moves in response to component B, the machine performs its function exactly as intended. But people operated on principles that no amount of careful study seemed to reliably clarify. Emotions were variables that resisted the kind of control and predictability that he required in order to feel secure. And so he retreated, gently but consistently, into the reassuring world of organized systems. He cataloged his art collection. He structured his philanthropic commitments. He tracked his own health with a clinical and systematic thoroughness that was decades ahead of the popular interest in personal wellness, carefully weighing his food portions and calculating his daily caloric intake with the precision of a laboratory researcher. As the years accumulated and he moved deeper into the later decades of his life, the house began to feel less like a monument to achievement and more like a monument to time's passage. The close friends of his earlier decades passed away one by one. The business colleagues he had known since the early days of Kodak's growth retired and receded from regular contact. The world visible through the tall windows of the mansion was undergoing rapid and exhilarating transformation. The jazz age was in full and vibrant bloom. The cultural energy of the 1920s was loud and irreverent and forward-looking in ways that seemed to belong to a generation entirely different from his own. But inside 900 East Avenue, the rhythm of daily life moved at the pace of a much earlier era. The pipe organ played the same classical programs. The meals arrived at the same scheduled times. The morning routine proceeded in its unchanging sequence. He was becoming, without intending it and without quite being able to stop it, a historical figure still moving through a world that had already moved on without him. The image of the eccentric and isolated wealthy bachelor is one that culture sometimes treats with a kind of affectionate amusement, as though the condition were something chosen and comfortable. But the actual reality of George Eastman's daily life in his later years was something considerably more difficult than that comfortable image suggests. It was a sustained and exhausting daily engagement with an emptiness that no level of wealth, no accumulation of honors, and no carefully organized schedule could fill or diminish. He attempted to address it through the act of giving. He became one of the most consequential philanthropists in the history of the United States, distributing more than $100 million to institutions and causes that he believed would reduce human suffering and expand human potential. He operated on the belief, expressed with characteristic directness, that a wealthy man who retains his fortune until death dies in a state of disgrace. He gave to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He gave to the Tuskegee Institute. He built a school of music and a great theater for the people of his city. He was attempting to construct a legacy that would outlast the limits of his own name, trying to ensure that the meaning of his life extended beyond the manufacture of photographic film. But as he himself seems to have understood at some quiet and honest level, philanthropy is a deeply insufficient substitute for the warmth of personal belonging. You cannot embrace a university. A wing of a hospital will not sit with you in the evening hours when the house is very still and the memory of your mother's face rises unbidden in your mind. He was purchasing permanence for his name with extraordinary generosity and discipline. But the comfort that his soul required was not available for purchase at any price. By the opening weeks of 1932, the atmosphere inside the mansion at 900 East Avenue had taken on a quality that was distinctly different from the ordinary silence of a quiet household. It had become the particular and pressurized silence of a waiting room, the kind of stillness that accumulates when something significant and inevitable is drawing very near. George Eastman was 77 years old, and the degenerative spinal condition that had been advancing steadily through his lower back and spine for the past 2 years had progressed well beyond the stage of manageable discomfort. His movement through the house, once characterized by the brisk and purposeful stride of a man who knew exactly where he was going and intended to arrive there without delay, had been reduced to a careful, slow, and visibly effortful shuffle. He found himself pausing frequently in the long hallways to lean against the marble surfaces of the walls, gathering the concentration and the physical resources necessary to continue to the next room. The pain in his lower back and spine was persistent and significant, sending sharp signals along pathways that had once carried the uncomplicated physical confidence of a healthy and active man. But as considerable as the physical pain was, It represented only one dimension of what George Eastman was navigating in those final weeks. The deeper and more consuming challenge was psychological. He was a man who had constructed the entire architecture of his identity on the foundational premise of absolute self-sufficiency. He had built himself up from the vulnerability of a fatherless and impoverished childhood to a position of global influence and independent authority entirely through the application of his own intelligence and his own will. The prospect of a future in which that will became increasingly irrelevant, in which the simplest physical necessities of daily life would require the assistance of another person, was not merely uncomfortable to him. It was, from his particular perspective, a form of existence that he had already examined carefully and already decided he was not willing to accept. He had been given an intimate and prolonged preview of that particular future in the memory of his mother's final years. He carried a clear and detailed recollection of the nurses and the careful spoons and the expression of confused and helpless vulnerability that had gradually replaced the bright and capable light in the eyes of the woman he had loved most. He looked at his own hands now, noting the tremor that had begun to appear, and he recognized with the kind of clear-eyed practicality that had always been his defining characteristic exactly what he was observing. He was watching the early construction of his own chains. For a man who approached every aspect of existence as a series of problems demanding efficient and intelligent solutions, the body's progressive deterioration was not a tragedy to be mourned or a burden to be endured with stoic resignation. It was a mechanical malfunction of a fundamental kind, and George Eastman had never been the sort of person who allowed malfunctions to persist when a clear alternative was available. The final weeks of his life were conducted with the same methodical and deliberate precision that had characterized every significant undertaking of his extraordinary career. He did not spend them in agitation or in expressions of grief and regret. He spent them in the organized and careful completion of outstanding business. He reviewed each of his established trusts with meticulous attention. He confirmed that all of his philanthropic commitments to the University of Rochester and to the dental health programs he had funded in European cities were properly structured and fully funded. He ensured that the members of his family and the members of his household who depended on him for their well-being would continue to be adequately provided for. He examined the financial accounts. He verified the legal arrangements. He was closing the ledgers of a corporation that had operated for 77 years and whose final audit he intended to be impeccable. On the morning of March 14, 1932, George Eastman conducted his final day with the same composed and attentive manner that he had brought to every other important day of his life. He met with his attorneys one final time to execute a formal codicil to his will, ensuring that every disposition of his considerable estate was documented with precision and legal clarity. He was engaged and present throughout the meeting. He was sharp and clear in his thinking. He even offered a brief and characteristically dry observation that drew a polite smile from the men assembled in the room. When the meeting concluded and his attorneys departed, he did not reach for a telephone to call someone he cared about. He did not seek out the comfort of another person's presence. There was, in the truest sense, no one of that kind to call. He simply moved to his bedroom on the second floor of the mansion, that quiet and carefully maintained room at the heart of the golden cage he had assembled around himself over so many decades. He sat down at his desk and composed the note that would eventually become one of the most analyzed and discussed farewell messages in the modern history of human achievement. To my friends, he wrote, "My work is done. Why wait?" It was a message of absolute and unornamented clarity. It carried no self-pity. It offered no philosophical elaboration. It stripped the entire weight of the decision down to its essential and irreducible logic. Why wait for the wheelchair to arrive? Why wait for a nurse to take over the functions that his hands could no longer reliably perform? Why wait to become the object of the sorrowful and helpless compassion of others? It was the final act of an engineer. The project has reached its conclusion. The remaining costs exceed the remaining value of continued operation. Turn off the lights and close the facility with dignity. He then prepared the room with a level of considerate and practical attention that was profoundly and almost unbearably characteristic of the man. He took a damp and neatly folded cloth and placed it with care upon his chest. He positioned himself on the bed with deliberate attention to his own physical comfort, adjusting the pillows to reduce the pressure on his spine one final time. He was not trembling. He was not weeping. He was conducting a final procedure with the steady and professional composure of the engineer he had always been. He took a long and quiet breath. He allowed his thoughts to settle, perhaps resting for a brief moment on the memory of his mother, on the early and exciting days of chemical experiments and first patents and the growing certainty that something genuinely important was taking shape in his hands. And then, with the same extraordinary steadiness of hand that had signed the documents of a $100 million enterprise and extended itself in greeting to presidents and princes, he made his final choice, and the long story of his life came to its deliberate and self-directed close. The sound that carried through the great house in that moment was a quiet and muffled report, absorbed almost entirely by the heavy draperies and the rich fabrics that lined the room. It did not shake the chandeliers or bring the staff rushing immediately to the staircase. It sounded, to the ears of the people moving quietly through the floors below, like a heavy book dropping flat onto a hard surface from a considerable height. Mr. Eastman was, after all, a man who handled many large volumes, and small domestic accidents of that kind were not entirely unknown in his household. But as the silence that followed that sound extended itself beyond any ordinary duration, as it grew heavier and more particular in a way that was difficult to name but impossible to ignore, an unmistakable sense of changed circumstance began to move through the staff of 900 East Avenue. The house itself seemed to be communicating something. The atmosphere of the place had shifted in a way that everyone who had worked there long enough could feel immediately, even if none of them could have articulated precisely how they knew. When they finally gathered their concern into action and entered the room together, everything was exactly as he had arranged it. The man who had transformed, more profoundly than almost any other individual in the history of recorded civilization, the way that human beings perceived and documented and remembered their own existence, had taken his leave of that existence in precisely the manner he had chosen. He was gone. And the room was exactly as tidy as he had intended it to be. The deep and layered irony of this specific moment has a quality that no novelist working in the tradition of deliberate literary construction could improve upon. At the very instant that George Eastman made his final departure from the world, the invention that bore the name he had chosen because he loved the letter K was in active use by millions of human hands on every continent the earth possessed. In a sunlit park in Paris, a father was kneeling on the grass and lifting a small Kodak camera toward the face of his laughing daughter. On a busy London street corner, a traveler was raising that same kind of camera to preserve the face of Big Ben against a bright spring sky. In a celebration hall in Tokyo, an entire extended family dressed in formal attire was gathering before a photographer to record the memory of a wedding that would be passed through generations of descendants who had not yet been born. George Eastman had dedicated his most creative and energetic decades to the construction of a device that gave humanity the power to stop time, to hold a moment of happiness or love or ordinary daily beauty in place forever, to look again at the face of someone beloved long after time had carried that face beyond reach. He was, in the fullest and most accurate sense of the phrase, the architect of modern human memory. He had filled the family albums of the entire world with the images of joy and celebration and ordinary life that people treasure most deeply. But in the privacy of his own bedroom, surrounded by the products of a lifetime of extraordinary and world-changing effort, he was unable to find within himself any persuasive reason to preserve even one more day of his own experience within the frame of continued living. He was the greatest visionary of the 19th century, a man who had seen with perfect clarity what the future of human communication and documentation required, long before anyone around him had begun to imagine it. Before George Eastman reimagined and rebuilt the practice of photography from its foundations, it had been a field of activity accessible only to the educated and the financially privileged few. He had opened that field to everyone from the youngest child to the most elderly grandparent, and in doing so he had altered the fundamental texture of human experience in ways that continue to reverberate through the 21st century. Because of what he built, the world remembers its own past with a vividness and a detail that no previous era of human history had been able to access. Because of his vision and his relentless practical intelligence, history is no longer merely a written record. It has a face. It has expression. It is alive in the images he made possible. But the man who created this transformative gift for humanity moved through his personal life in the company of a profound and persistent isolation that no amount of wealth, no level of recognition, and no degree of philanthropic achievement could adequately address or repair. The note he placed on his desk on the morning of March 14, 1932, asks a question that has continued to unsettle and provoke serious reflection in the decades that have followed. Why wait? It is a question that communicates with disquieting clarity the interior landscape of a mind that had always engaged with life as a sequence of problems requiring rational and efficient management. When a project reaches its natural conclusion and the cost of maintaining its diminishing operations exceeds the value that those operations can still produce, the responsible and logical course is to bring them to a close in an orderly manner. It was the language of a factory manager reviewing a production line. But it was also, beneath its cool and rational surface, the expression of something far more human and far more painful. It was the voice of a man who had constructed around himself, across 77 years of intensely purposeful living, a fortress of self-sufficiency so complete and so impenetrable that the warmth of genuine human connection had been unable to find its way through for a very long time. The mansion at 900 East Avenue was never, in any deeply felt sense, a home. It was a monument. It was a physical record of achievement, maintained to an extraordinary standard of order and beauty, occupied by a single human being who moved through its many rooms with the manner of someone who was curating an important collection rather than inhabiting a personal space. He moved through its hallways in the evening hours while the hired organist played music through the great pipes, and the sound filled room after room with a beauty that somehow made the silence beneath it more rather than less apparent. He ate his precisely measured meals at the long dining table under the crystal chandeliers and read the news from a world that was moving at an increasingly unfamiliar pace. This is not simply the account of a wealthy and celebrated man reaching the end of a long life under difficult physical circumstances. It is something considerably more instructive and considerably more enduring than that. It is the story of what genius costs at the human level. It is the story of what can happen when a person of extraordinary capability and extraordinary drive gives everything they have and everything they are to the construction of an empire, and arrives at the far end of that construction to discover that they are standing in a vast and beautiful and largely empty space with no one nearby to share it with. We study the photographs of the 1920s and we admire the captured happiness in the faces looking back at us from those black and white images, and we seldom pause long enough to think about the man whose vision and determination and lifelong sacrifice made those photographs possible. We enjoy the preserved light without fully considering the life of the man who spent his years learning how to preserve it and what that effort ultimately cost him. George Eastman spent his professional life in the dedicated and masterful pursuit of clarity, working to sharpen the image of the world and make it accessible to everyone. But his own interior world grew progressively less clear as the years accumulated and the isolation deepened, until eventually it blurred into a gray and painful haze from which he could find no path forward, and so he made the deliberate and final decision to step out of the frame he had spent so long constructing. When the police arrived at 900 East Avenue later that afternoon and the information began to move outward through Rochester and then across the country and eventually around the world, the reaction was one of immediate and genuine shock. The New York Times carried the account prominently on its front page the following morning. The flags at Kodak Park were lowered with respect and solemnity to half-mast. The city of Rochester, which George Eastman had done more to shape and improve than perhaps any other single individual in its history, entered a period of authentic collective mourning. But among those who had known him in the personal rather than the professional sense of that word, those few individuals who had spent enough time in his company to see beneath the surface of the careful and disciplined public persona he maintained, there was something that coexisted alongside the grief. There was a quiet and deeply uncomfortable recognition that, at some level, this particular ending had never been entirely unimaginable. He had lived according to his own judgment and his own standards without compromise or apology across the full span of his extraordinary life, and it was entirely consistent with everything he had always been that he would choose to depart from it in precisely the same manner. The question written on that yellow legal pad did not fade with the formal observances of mourning. It lingered with remarkable persistence in the corridors of the factory and in the halls of the mansion and in the private thoughts of everyone who had known him and everyone who had followed his remarkable story. Why wait? It was a challenge directed at every living person who encountered it. It was the final formal statement of a man who had spent the better part of 8 decades attempting to bring the beautiful and chaotic complexity of human experience into clear and perfectly composed focus. And so the empire of the camera had lost the extraordinary individual who had imagined it and built it and given it to the world. The 50-room mansion with its magnificent silent organ stood as the permanent architectural testament to the man who had filled it with sound and then left it empty. The invention of 1888 had outlived its inventor, as great inventions always do. But the cameras kept clicking in their millions. The shutters kept opening and closing with their familiar mechanical precision. The world kept accumulating its store of captured moments and preserved faces and frozen fragments of happiness and ordinary daily beauty. It kept doing all of this even as the man who had made the entire enterprise possible composed his own final image on a cold March afternoon and chose to let the shutter fall for the last time. To fully understand how George Eastman arrived at this profoundly considered and irreversible decision, it is necessary to rewind the entire film of his story back to its beginning. It is necessary to travel back beyond the pain of his final years and beyond the grandeur of the mansion and beyond the $100 million philanthropy and beyond the global reputation. It is necessary to find the moment when the idea of Kodak existed as nothing more than a restless, ambitious, an absolutely compelling question in the mind of a young man who had wanted to document a journey but could not afford the equipment required to do it properly. We need to witness the rise in order to understand the full weight of the departure. We need to watch the empire being assembled with patience and intelligence and relentless effort, one carefully filed patent and one carefully negotiated agreement at a time, in order to understand why the man who built it ultimately arrived at the quiet and absolute conviction that he had no remaining reason to delay the conclusion of his story. To appreciate the true and staggering scale of what George Eastman eventually walked away from on that gray afternoon, you have to be willing to travel back to a world that operated at a fundamentally different speed and with fundamentally different tools than anything we now recognize. You have to return to the 1870s, a decade in which the act of producing a single photograph required a level of scientific knowledge, physical endurance, and financial investment that placed it firmly beyond the reach of the overwhelming majority of human beings alive at that time. If you wanted to take a photograph in that era, you did not reach into your coat pocket and remove a small device. You organized an expedition. You brought a heavy wooden tripod, a large and awkward camera, a portable darkroom tent, and an entire crate of fragile and expensive glass plates. You mixed your own photographic emulsion from a volatile and chemically complex substance called collodion, applied it carefully to each glass plate, sensitized the coated plate in a silver nitrate bath, positioned it in the camera with great urgency before the chemicals could dry, made your exposure, and then rushed back into the darkness of your tent to complete the development process before anything could degrade or fail. The chemicals involved were harsh and hazardous. The process was physically exhausting. The equipment was heavy and fragile. And the results were frequently imperfect despite all of that effort. Photography was, in every practical sense, an activity conducted by trained professionals and deeply committed enthusiasts with the resources and the knowledge to manage its considerable demands. The vast majority of ordinary human beings in that era would live and die without ever owning a single photograph of themselves or of the people they loved. And then a young man named George Eastman decided that this situation was unacceptable and set about changing it with everything he had. George Eastman was not a man of inherited privilege. He arrived in the world under modest circumstances, and the earliest years of his life were shaped more by loss and responsibility than by ease or advantage. He was born in 1854 in the small community of Waterville in upstate New York, and his family relocated to Rochester when he was still a young child. His father died when George was 7 years old, leaving the family without income and facing a period of genuine and sustained financial difficulty. George Eastman did not spend his childhood in the company of games and idle hours. He spent it watching his mother Maria work with extraordinary determination and personal sacrifice to keep the family housed and fed, opening their home to paying boarders and directing every ounce of her energy toward the welfare of her children. That intimate and formative experience of watching the person he loved most navigate poverty with courage and resourcefulness left a permanent mark on the young George. It created in him a driving and lifelong determination to achieve financial security so complete and so permanent that nothing like what his family had endured could ever reach him again. He left school at 14 to begin working as an office assistant at an insurance company, earning $3 per week and applying himself with an intensity and a seriousness that set him apart from others his age. He was not a boy who daydreamed about adventure or fame. He was a boy who understood very clearly what financial vulnerability felt like and who had decided, with a quiet and unshakable determination that would eventually carry him to the top of the American industrial hierarchy, that he would spend his life building the strongest possible protection against it. The moment that changed the course of his life, and in a very real sense the course of modern history, arrived with the almost casual timing of genuine turning points. At 24 years of age, Eastman made plans to travel to Santo Domingo and wanted to document the journey with photographs. He dutifully acquired all of the equipment that this ambition required at the time, and what arrived was a collection of gear so heavy and so cumbersome that it genuinely required a pack animal to transport. Eastman looked at that mountain of equipment with the analytical clarity of an engineer confronting a poorly designed system, and his response was immediate and absolute. He rejected the entire arrangement. He did not go to Santo Domingo. Instead, he redirected the full force of his considerable intelligence and his considerable determination toward a single question that would occupy him for the next several years and ultimately reshape the world. How do I make this simpler? He returned to his mother's kitchen every evening after completing his hours at the bank and began the long process of experimentation that would eventually produce the answer. He mixed emulsions and conducted heating tests and read every technical publication on photographic chemistry that he could obtain from any source available to him. He worked with a focus and an intensity that left almost no time for sleep. He was trying to solve the problem of the glass plate, to find a lighter and more flexible alternative that could carry a photographic emulsion without requiring the elaborate preparation and the fragile and heavy transport that glass demanded. He built a machine to coat dry plates. He experimented with paper. He refined and adjusted and tested and refined again. And finally, after years of this sustained and solitary effort, he arrived at the invention that would open the door to a completely new era of human visual culture. He developed a transparent and flexible photographic film that could be rolled into a compact form and handled without specialized training or elaborate preparation. In 1888, George Eastman presented this achievement to the world in the form of a small, simple, and remarkably elegant device that he called the Kodak. The name was his own invention, chosen because he admired the decisive and energetic quality of the letter K and wanted a word that could be pronounced with equal clarity in any language on earth. The camera itself was a masterpiece of purposeful simplicity. It arrived in the buyer's hands already loaded with a roll of film capable of recording 100 separate images. It required no glass plates, no chemical mixing, no darkroom tent, and no technical training of any kind. The photographer pointed it at a subject, drew a simple cord to prepare the shutter, and pressed a button. When the full roll of film had been used, the photographer mailed the entire camera to the factory in Rochester. The skilled staff there developed the film, produced the finished photographs, reloaded the camera with fresh film, and returned everything to the photographer by post. The complete transaction cost $25. The 6-word slogan that Eastman composed to introduce this device to the public was one of the most effective and enduring pieces of commercial writing in the history of advertising. You press the button, we do the rest. The impact of this invention on the world was immediate and transformative in ways that are genuinely difficult to overstate. Photography moved from the exclusive domain of the professionally trained to the open and welcoming territory of everyone. The young mother recording her infant's first steps. The elderly grandparent wanting a portrait of the grandchildren to keep beside the bed. The family gathering at a summer celebration and wanting to hold the memory of it in their hands. Every ordinary person in every country who had ever looked at something beautiful or precious or important and wanted to be able to look at it again. George Eastman had given all of them the means to do exactly that. The Kodak camera moved across the world with a momentum that defied all expectations. By 1896, the company had manufactured its 100,000th camera, and the production facilities in Rochester were expanding continuously to meet a demand that showed no signs of slowing. Kodak Park grew from a single factory complex into an entire self-contained industrial community with its own infrastructure, its own services, and its own economic ecosystem. The financial consequences for George Eastman were extraordinary. He became one of the wealthiest men in the United States, a figure of genuine national and international significance who occupied a place in the history of American industry alongside the greatest names of the Gilded Age. But unlike many of the dominant industrialists of his era, who cultivated public reputations built on power and self-interest, Eastman was perceived differently. He was reserved and unassuming in his public manner. He believed in the quality of his products with genuine conviction and expressed that conviction through continuous investment in research and manufacturing standards rather than personal self-promotion. He treated his workers with a consideration and a generosity that was unusual for the period, offering them profit-sharing arrangements and stock ownership programs that gave them a genuine stake in the success of the enterprise they helped to build each day. He paid well above the going rate because he believed, with an apparent sincerity that those who worked for him seemed to recognize and appreciate, that people who contributed to the building of something valuable deserved to share meaningfully in its rewards. But the unprecedented accumulation of wealth that accompanied all of this success introduced a new and unfamiliar challenge to a man whose entire previous life had been defined by the concrete and manageable problems of building something from nothing. What was a man of his particular temperament and his particular circumstances to do with more money than any single person could rationally spend? George Eastman had no interest in the elaborate personal luxuries that many of his contemporaries in the American industrial aristocracy pursued with obvious enthusiasm. There would be no private yacht. There would be no string of thoroughbred racehorses. There would be no collection of jewels presented to a wife and family because there was, by his own choosing, no wife and no family. His life had always revolved around his work and around his mother, and those two centers of gravity had been enough. But the world took notice of extraordinary success, and the world expected the man at its center to occupy a residence that reflected the scale of his achievement. And so in 1905, construction began on what would become the most significant private residence in the history of the city of Rochester. Eastman did not commission a large house. He commissioned a palace. The design drew on the Georgian Revival architectural tradition, presenting to the world a facade of imposing and dignified authority built from reinforced concrete and carefully selected brick. The interior space extended across 35,000 square feet, divided among 50 rooms, 12 bathrooms, 9 fireplaces, a private elevator, a centralized vacuum cleaning system, a dedicated telephone switchboard, and every other convenience and technological advancement that the most sophisticated engineering of the early 20th century could provide. It was a structure designed to project permanence, to communicate through its materials and its proportions that its owner had achieved something so complete and so well-founded that it would endure without question through any storm or shifting circumstance. The materials used throughout the interior were selected with the same obsessive attention to quality that Eastman applied to the manufacture of his photographic products. The finest teak available from Indian forests, the most beautiful Italian marble for the floors and the columns, the richest French velvet for the soft furnishings that filled the rooms with warmth and color. The library held thousands of volumes, collected with care and arranged with precision. The dining room, under its crystal chandeliers, could accommodate large and elegant gatherings with space and comfort to spare. But the room that communicated most honestly and most poignantly about the inner life of the man who had built all of this was the music room, situated at the emotional center of the mansion. George Eastman's love of music was genuine and profound, and also, in a way that he seemed to find more amusing than frustrating, completely unsupported by any natural talent for its production. He could not play any instrument. He could not read musical notation. He struggled to reproduce even the simplest melody with his own voice. And yet this same man had one of the largest and most magnificent private Aeolian pipe organs in the entire country installed as the centerpiece of his home. He employed a professional organist on a regular and ongoing basis with the specific responsibility of coming to the estate each morning to perform while Eastman ate breakfast alone in the dining room. The sound of the organ filling the vast and quiet spaces of the mansion each morning was something that Eastman valued with a quiet intensity that he rarely expressed in words, but that everyone who spent time in the house understood and recognized. By the decade of the 1920s, George Eastman's position in the life of his city and his country had achieved a kind of historical permanence. He had built and funded the Eastman Theater, one of the most beautiful performance venues in the northeastern United States, as a gift to the musical life of Rochester and to the principle that great art should be available to everyone regardless of their financial circumstances. He had donated the funds necessary to build and sustain an outstanding medical school at the University of Rochester, an institution that would go on to produce generations of skilled physicians and medical researchers. He had written checks to dental health clinics in the major capitals of Europe, motivated by his personal conviction that the suffering caused by preventable dental disease was one of the most easily addressed and most often neglected sources of human misery in the industrialized world. He had become a philanthropist of genuine global reach, a man whose generosity had left its mark in stone and steel on important institutions across 2 continents. But as the Kodak enterprise reached the absolute peak of its commercial power and influence, as the financial metrics of the company achieved heights that seemed to require a new vocabulary to describe adequately, the individual at the center of the entire enterprise remained a figure of considerable and compelling personal mystery. From the outside he appeared to have everything: the money, the recognition, the respect, the legacy. But from the inside of that 50-room mansion, the view was considerably more complicated. Each evening, he returned to a house that was magnificent and perfectly maintained and entirely silent except for the sound of the organ that he had arranged to have played so that the silence would not be total. The mansion at 900 East Avenue was the crowning architectural expression of his achievement, the physical translation of the entire journey from the household of a fatherless and financially struggling boy to the acknowledged position of the wealthiest and most celebrated bachelor in the most prosperous nation in the world. But empires are profoundly lonely places for the individuals who occupy their centers alone. The story of George Eastman's rise is the most compelling version of the classic American narrative of self-invention and disciplined achievement. It is the story of a precise and brilliant mind applied with relentless persistence to a problem that everyone could see but no one else had the combination of knowledge and determination and practical engineering skill to solve. But as we follow him forward through the years into the later chapters of his story, it becomes essential to look past the financial statements and the expanding factory rooftops and the framed photographs of world leaders and royalty that lined his study walls. It becomes essential to step through the front door of the mansion and to see it clearly for what it was in the experience of the man who lived inside it. It was not a reward. It was a refuge. It was a beautifully constructed enclosure built by a man who had spent his entire adult life organizing the world's beautiful chaos into the clean and controllable geometry of a photographic frame and who had never quite discovered how to apply that same organizing intelligence to the question of his own happiness and sense of belonging. The great invention of 1888 had grown into an empire that stretched across the globe. But inside the walls of the house that empire had built, a quieter and more difficult story had been accumulating in the silence for years, growing louder with each passing season, waiting with the patient certainty of something that cannot be indefinitely postponed for its inevitable conclusion to arrive. Today, the mansion at 900 East Avenue stands as a museum open to the public, a place where visitors from around the world can walk through the corridors where George Eastman paced in the long hours of sleepless nights, can see the desk where he composed the note that millions of people have since read and reflected upon, can stand in the dining room where he ate alone under the crystal chandeliers while the organ played in the distance. It is a beautiful place, filled with the history of photography and with the artifacts of one of the most consequential individual careers in the history of modern industrial civilization. But if you stand alone in the master bedroom on a quiet Tuesday afternoon when the museum is not crowded and the tour groups have passed through and moved on, you can still feel the weight of the particular silence that fills that room. It is the silence that a very large house generates when only one person remains inside it. It is the silence of a man who understood, perhaps earlier and more clearly than anyone around him, that he had built something extraordinary and permanent in the world but had not managed to build the one thing that would have made the building worthwhile. He had built an empire of glass and light. He had given the world an instrument for capturing and holding the moments that matter most. But in the room where his story concluded, surrounded by the beautiful and expensive evidence of a life that had produced more than almost any other life of its era, he sat alone and found that the most important question was not how much had been accomplished. It was who was there to share it with. The legacy of George Eastman resists simple summary because the man himself resisted it. He was a benefactor of extraordinary generosity. He was a genius of practical invention. He was a pioneer who opened entire new territories of human experience and made them available to everyone without exception. He made the world brighter and clearer and more visually documented than it had ever been before. But his ending asks us to consider something that is deeply uncomfortable and deeply important. You cannot patent contentment. You cannot manufacture a solution to the particular human need for belonging and intimate connection on an industrial assembly line, no matter how efficient and how well managed that assembly line may be. You cannot purchase your way out of the fundamental conditions of human experience, regardless of how many millions you have available to deploy in the attempt. In the end, the Kodak king was a man sitting alone in a quiet room, asking the world a question that still hangs in the air above the mansion on East Avenue almost a century after he wrote it. When the work is finished and the house is empty and the applause of the world has faded to an indistinct murmur in the distance, what remains? George Eastman looked for an answer in every place his remarkable intelligence and his extraordinary resources could direct him. He could not find one that was sufficient. And so on a cold and gray March afternoon in 1932, the man who had devoted his life to preserving every important moment for the world chose, with great deliberateness and great clarity of mind, to stop capturing moments of his own. The camera shutter closed. The film reached its end. And the man who had given the world the gift of memory composed his own final image and allowed it, quietly and on his own terms, to fade.